My name is Amr Zar. We are here at this One State in Palestine panel. The three of us today on the panel are going to be me. Again, my name is Amr. I am a Palestinian American. I'm a stand-up comedian. I'm also a writer and an author. I'm also a law professor at the University of Detroit Mercy, where I teach on Arab American issues specifically on race, critical race theory, and those kinds of things. And I've written a lot on Palestine, and I perform in Palestine all the time, 3 or 4 times a year. And I founded a couple comedy festivals. One is called the Dearborn Comedy Fest, the 1001 Laughs Dearborn Comedy Festival, which is now since 5th year in Dearborn, Michigan. And then also the 1001 Laughs Palestine Comedy Festival, which this summer will be in its 3rd year in Palestine, where we take comedians and we do 5 days of stand-up comedy in Ramallah, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem. Also on the panel with us is Miko Peled, an activist and writer, author of The General's Son, coming from a prominent sort of 1948 Zionist family, and then have sort of evolved in their politics over the years. And Miko is, to Palestinians and Israelis, a hero on the left of our politics. And then our last speaker, when she gets here, is Lamis Deek. She is a Palestinian American attorney right here in New York City. She represents a lot of people in criminal and immigration matters. She's also a full-time activist as well on Palestine, writing and speaking widely on issues, and especially the right of return all around the country. I want to start out talking a little bit about the idea of one state. Can we close that door? Is that possible?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Hopefully Lamis finds us. Thanks. Oh, thanks. If you look at what Israel's been doing for the past 70 years, it's pretty clear, and especially after 1967, that they want all the land. Okay, we have this triangle of land that we call Palestine. That's why we call ourselves Palestinians, because we're from that place. And Israel's made it very clear that they want all the land. Currently, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 settlers inside the West Bank. Some of the biggest cities, even compared to cities that are inside the Green Line or inside Israel, exist in the West Bank. So huge complexes like Modi'in, Ma'ale Adomim, which are around Jerusalem, and Ariel, which is one of the largest settlements in the West Bank near Nablus, and they've built a university there. Okay, generally, when you build a university, you're probably not going anywhere, or do you have plans to go anywhere? So they've decided that they're not going anywhere. They've decided that the West Bank, at least, is part of Israel. Gaza is another conversation, but they want Gaza too. Not only for maybe some biblical purposes, but also they have found natural gas off of Gaza. And generally, you don't bomb places you don't want, generally. I mean, people usually bomb places they want. We bombed Iraq. Now it has the biggest U.S. embassy in the world. So generally, you don't bomb places you don't want in some way or another. So Israel has decided that it's not going anywhere. What they have not come to terms with yet is the fact that we are not going anywhere either, we Palestinians. They've tried very hard to get rid of us over the past 70 years, and it's not going very well. They're not very good at it. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. There's been many of us talking about one state for a very long time. In fact, Edward Said wrote about it in the early 90s, before Oslo even, talking about one secular democratic state in all of historic Palestine, or Mandate Palestine, or whatever you want to call it. But it came back up a little bit earlier this year when our president was at this press conference with Netanyahu. Sorry, at the press conference. Sorry, let me be straight. At a press conference with Netanyahu in the White House, and he said one state, two state, whatever, whatever they want. Basically that's what he said. And because I'm sure Netanyahu was in his ear about this. Of course, one state to Netanyahu means something different than what we're going to talk about today. One state to them means get all the land, somehow figure out how to get rid of the people, or to classify them in some way as in which you don't need to deal with them. And of course, we mean it in a there's limits. So we mean it in a very different way. When we talk about one state, we're talking about one secular democratic state without any regard to ethnic supremacy or religious supremacy or anything like that. Doesn't sound like it should not sound like that crazy of an idea, but that's what we're talking about when we talk about it. Israel somehow maintains this. I heard Ilan Pappé give a talk a couple months ago, where, and he has said this many times, where he said basically it functions as one state now. Basically you have one state in Palestine now, just with different classifications for different groups of people. In many ways, that's true. Israel's created a structure in which Palestinians are sort of classified into 5 different groups of people, right? You have the Palestinians who live in the West Bank, who have one legal classification under the Israeli system. You have Palestinians who live in Gaza who have a different legal classification under the Israeli system. You have Palestinians who live in Jerusalem who are permanent residents of the state without national voting rights, only local voting rights, get benefits from the state like healthcare and whatnot, but can't vote for their prime minister. And then you have Palestinians who live inside of Israel who are technically full Israeli citizens, but of course marginalized greatly by the state. For instance, majority Arab schools or fully Arab schools get $1 for every student, whereas or they get $1 for every $3 that Jewish students get in public schools there. And then of course you have Palestinians who live in the diaspora, who have a totally different legal status, basically sort of non-existent legal status as far as Israel is concerned. But we're talking about a secular democratic state where anybody can live freely. Now, I have 6 reasons why I think one state would work and should work very well. First of all, the first reason is what I call the Solomon effect. Okay? This is the don't split the baby in half effect. If you talk to Palestinians and you talk to Israelis and you ask them to draw, if you asked Miko to draw his country and you asked me to draw my country, we would draw the same thing. Okay? So there's no sort of existential difference between what we think our country. In fact, if you go to the Israeli Ministry of Tourism website, there's no lines around the Gaza Strip. Around the West Bank. And they have some sort of delineation around the Gaza Strip, but there's no lines around. In their eyes, officially, the West Bank is not disputed or even occupied or whatever. So let's not split the baby in half. If you ask, that's number one. If you ask Palestinians and Israelis to draw their country, we both draw that triangle that you see Palestinians wearing around their necks or tattooing on their bodies or whatever. Number 2, and the next few are more practical. The financial system wouldn't need to change. Currently, the Israeli financial system is in effect in all of historic Palestine, including the West Bank, and even including in the, terrorist-run Gaza Strip. They made it sound like Hamas took over and implemented their own system and all that kind of stuff. That's just not true. Gaza Strip is still obviously under full occupation. It's under a blockade. Israel decides everything that gets in and out, including people. And the currency system to this day is the Israeli currency system, the Israeli financial system. Along with currency, infrastructure is all Israeli. So for instance, Palestinian cell phone companies basically buy bandwidth from Israeli because Israel owns all the bandwidth. And they buy bandwidth from Israeli cell phone companies and resell it to Palestinians in the West Bank. A Palestinian in the West Bank, a stateless Palestinian in the West Bank pays more for his cell phone bill every month than an Israeli does who lives in Tel Aviv, because they're buying it from, it's not theirs. So they're resellers. So the infrastructure from the point of view of currency and data, water, electricity, I mean, Israel can flip a switch and shut off the electricity in the Gaza Strip. Why? Because they run everything. Okay? So the infrastructure would not need to change. You wouldn't need to all of a sudden set up a new thing for a new territory. Third, one state would solve the issue of settlements in a weird way. I mean, settlements would not be settlements anymore. They would be part of one state. And so settlers would just be now living in this whole new one state. They wouldn't need to go. There might need to be obviously many issues addressed about land expropriation, confiscation, compensation, those kinds of things. But there would not be any more talk of anybody needing to go anywhere. 4, the issue of Jerusalem. Now Jerusalem, let me put on like my nerdy law professor hat for 1 second. So Jerusalem since 1948 has been this thing, this Latin term that they use to describe the legal status of it called corpus separatum, which means that has its own special legal status. The entire city, by the way, not just the east side or the west side, the entire city, and is no one's sovereignty over it is recognized. Okay, that's the entire city. In the UN partition plan, Jerusalem was envisioned as sort of like an international thing, and that's never changed from the point of view of policies of every state in the world. That is why, even though Israel declares Jerusalem as its capital, that no one locates their embassies there. Okay, even in West Jerusalem, no one locates embassies there. Everyone locates their embassies in Tel Aviv because, again, the issue of recognition. You don't just, the way the world works in internet, you don't just get up and say this is our capital and these are our borders. You can ask other countries or through the UN to recognize these things. And the UN has never recognized that Jerusalem is part of anywhere, okay, that it's this corpus separatum. That's why, if you might have remembered, a few years ago there was a Supreme Court case where an American family of Jewish descent had their kids in Jerusalem, and they wanted their American passport to say that their place of birth was Israel. And the State Department refused, because that's American policy, is that anyone that's born in Jerusalem is born in a place called Jerusalem. They are not born in a country. They're not born in a nation called Israel. Okay, east or west, by the way. It's a whole city. But one state would solve this problem. I mean, if this new one state of Palestinians and Israelis got together and said, hey, we would like Jerusalem to be part of our state and be our capital, the whole world would agree. No problem. You can make it your state, make it your capital. It no longer needs to be under dispute. And it can be the eternal capital, as Benjamin Netanyahu likes to call it, of this new state. Not the internal undivided capital of Jewish people, no. The internal capital of this new state, if we like. So Jerusalem would be solved. Number 5. There's a demographic problem in Israel, well, for Israel, in Israel. Palestinians, how can I say this nicely?
Can't.
We reproduce a lot, okay? And we love each other very much, okay? And this is a reality and a problem for Israel that that they can't deal with. And so, for instance, in 1948, when Israel expelled about 750,000 Palestinians, my father among them, and these became refugees around the world, and descendants of these refugees around the world, 150,000 Palestinians remained in what is today Israel, not counting the West Bank and Gaza Strip. 150,000 Palestinians remained. If they would have grown at the normal average global birth rate of the world, after 69 years they would be mathematically around 450,000 people. They are currently 1.7 million people. Okay? Gaza Strip has the same thing. They were 180,000 people in 1948. Now they're hitting 1.8 million people. So this sort of demographics is something, again, that Israel has not come to terms with. They're kind of ignoring this. In fact, there's a whole billboard campaign happening around Tel Aviv. I'm sure Miko saw it. A whole billboard campaign happening mostly in Tel Aviv, but in most of Israel as well, but especially around Tel Aviv. That is this big billboard with a bunch of, like a crowd full of Palestinians, and it says in Arabic it says "Qariban sanakun al-aghlabiyya," which means in English, pretty soon we'll be the majority. Okay? Then it has like a little phone number to call, and if you call the phone number, somebody picks up and starts speaking to you. Somebody from the left in Israel starts speaking to you in Hebrew that says, "We better give the Palestinians a state, otherwise this is what's going to happen." Okay?
Don't the Orthodox Jews reproduce a lot?
No, but they do, but they're a very small amount of the population. Well, we are, in other words, the high reproduction rates among Jewish residents inside all of historic Palestine, the high reproduction rate is low among the greater population. That's not true for us. So if you ask a Palestinian, like, how many kids you have, he goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you say to him, how old are they? He goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so so it is. It's very common now. The newer generations now maybe are having like 2 or 3 kids, but the generation of even my parents and people younger than my parents, it was very common to have 6, 7, 8 kids, and everyone was doing it. Okay, so I mean, it's like exponentially, So my mom's mom is one of 19. Okay, and so my mom has something in the neighborhood of 100 first cousins. First, okay, and so you just can't, and you just can't like catch up with that. Okay, so even if my generation is having 2 kids, it doesn't matter. It's too late. Like it's already happened. Okay. You can't reverse it. Just like in America, by the way. I mean, like, a lot of Trump's thing was trying to reverse the demographic flow of America, but it's too late. So you can't do anything about it anymore. The brownification of America is happening, and you're either with it or you're not, but you can't stop it, right? It's like the Titanic, right? The Titanic was in the ocean, and it hit an iceberg. And then a few hours later, they realized that there's a problem. Right? Like water was coming on, that was a problem, and a few hours after that it was in the bottom of the ocean. But even though they realized it a few hours later, it didn't matter. It was over when it hit the iceberg. Okay? It was over. And they're in the middle of the ocean, nowhere to help them. Well, same thing happening with the demographics inside Israel. And the other demographic problem that they have is that the issue of Israeli identity is falling apart. The idea of Israel is like a European sort of like enclave in the Middle East. This is false too, because now you have about 6 million Israeli Jews. Among those 6 million, you have, it started out with white, Israel was a white European colonial thing, right? Started out like that. Well, it turns out when they got there, it turns out that this whole thing of like land without a people, well, it turns out that's not true. So it turns out there was a lot of people there. So they had a demographic problem from the beginning. All right? And they brought European Jews, but that was not enough. All right. So then they started bringing Arab Jews in 49 and 50 in the 50s. Yemen, Iraq, Tunisia, Morocco, whatever, from all over. They brought all them. Now the idea of Israel doesn't really want these people, right? But you need them because you have a demographic problem. Then they still didn't have enough. So in the 70s and 80s they got Ethiopian Jews. Now the idea of Israel for sure does not like Africans, for sure, but numbers. And PR. Then they still didn't have enough. So then they went to Russia in the 90s and they said, hey, if you have like one grandparent that's Jewish, come on down. And 1 million came. Now they've been there for 25 or 30 years. The Israeli Jews of Russian descent have been there for 25 or 30 years, and they're more comfortable in society. And guess what they're doing? They're building churches. They are marrying Arab Christians. They're being buried in Arab Christian cemeteries, and they're speaking Russian. Because guess what? They're not Jews. They never saw themselves as Jews, but they saw a ticket out of the failing Soviet Union, free house, free job, whatever. And so one of the smallest numbers, I don't want to say the smallest, but a minority among minorities now is sort of the original Zionist Jews of European descent. And so what that means is, for instance, the amount of people who currently speak Hebrew as the native, like the really first native tongue in their house all the time, is really not that many people. The Arab Jews are speaking Arabic. Everyone speaks Hebrew, obviously, but the Arab Jews are speaking Arabic. In fact, the most popular band inside Israel right now is a band called Yemen Blues, who are the grandchildren of Yemeni immigrants from the late 40s and 50s, and they're singing in Arabic. It's the most popular band in Israel. So what does that mean? That means that they did not lose their culture. They didn't become Europeanized, right? They stayed Arabs, and which makes sense because they moved from an Arab land to an Arab land, right? It's like moving from California to Texas. You're not changing much, okay? And so they kept their culture there, and they're now the most popular band inside Israel. And being Arab, I should say here, is it's like contagious. Like you can't go somewhere and hang out, and you just can't turn. It's been Arab for 1,500 years. You cannot. Nothing you can do in 40, 50 years of 60, whatever, of occupation changes that. If you're in the old city of Jerusalem and you want to conduct business and you don't want to get cheated, you need to speak Arabic. You speak any other language, you're going to get cheated because you're a tourist, right? So it's an Arab place, and it has been, and it will remain. And so all these demographic issues that I'm talking about, right? Now, again, well, it's only an issue to you, it's only a problem for you if you're a racist or if you believe in ethnic supremacy in the state. If you don't, then it's not a problem, and you can have a nice secular democratic state where everybody's equal. So all these demographic arguments and stuff, if you have a secular democratic state, get thrown aside. Finally, the economy. Number 6 is the economy. Palestine is... Okay, the Gulf states have a resource, oil. They're making a lot of money off of it. But they're encountering problems. It has fluctuating prices, and it runs out one day. Palestine, because God chose Palestine for whatever reason, and it is our natural resource is God. Okay? It brings millions and millions and millions of people to Palestine every year. And because of the nature of God, it is a renewable, never diminishing resource. Okay? What's that mean? That means if all of a sudden the land got opened up to the whole world. So right now there's, approaching 2 billion Muslims in the world, most of whom never visit because of either political reasons or they don't have diplomatic relations with whatever it might be. Imagine if the whole world was open to them. I mean, you need to build 50 hotels in Jerusalem and 50 hotels in Nazareth. You would have to imagine if Lebanese and Syrians could just drive in, how much money they would spend. I mean, Palestine would be the most self-sufficient tourist economy in the world. Okay? But it can't be that now because of Israel. But if it were totally opened up, I mean, no one would be wanting for anything there. Doing a one state, though, means small sacrifices for both Palestinians and Israel. Well, not small, pretty big emotional sacrifices. There's not going to be a Palestinian state, and there's not going to be a Jewish state. There's going to be one state. No more talking about a state here where these people live over here and these people live over there. So no ethnic separation, no state. We'd have to change some things. We'd have to change the flag. Obviously, it's a little, it's a little exclusive. I would change it to something. Maybe like 3 stripes of brown, green, brown to represent like a falafel patty or something like that. But it would have to change. But these are logistical things. It's not a big deal. You'd have to change the name of the place, probably. Probably can't call it Israel, although I don't really care. But I mean, I would imagine just to, you don't call it Israel, call it like Holy Land or Abrahamistan or just call the whole thing Jerusalem or just call the whole thing Jerusalem. Yeah, or I mean, I don't know if this would be a problem for Miko or other Jews in the room. We just keep calling it Palestine. It's already a Jewish name, right? Stein. And we could even respell it, if we have to. But there is, we'd have to do some of these things, change some of these things. But I say to people who are living in the land of Palestine, let's do it. Let's make one secular democratic state. Everyone has to give up some of these existential emotional ideas. No big deal, but we can get rich together, all right? And we can finally go quickly, more quickly, to the future that's coming to us anyway. I mean, the idea of there being some sort of separate Palestinian state is never going to happen, even among liberal, quote-unquote, liberal Zionists inside Israel. And I'll end by saying, if you watch the discourse in Israel, you'll see that those on the right say, let's figure out how to take all the land. Okay, Bennett, Netanyahu, these people. Let's figure out how to take all the land and give the Palestinians some sort of status so that we don't have to deal with them. But let's figure out how to take all the land because we don't want to live with the Palestinians. And the ones on the left say, well, no, let's give them like 20% of historic Palestine so that they live over here and we live over there because, again, we don't want to live with the Palestinians. Okay, I'm saying, we can do away with all of that. Palestinians, if you follow Palestinian thought over the last 30 years or so, we've stopped with all the stuff of like, up in the 80s, we stopped. When we have conversations with each other, our conversations are basically about whatever's going to happen is we're going to have to, figure out a way to live with these people. Whatever happens, nobody's probably going anywhere. Unfortunately, in Israel, they're still having conversations about how to get rid of us. And like I said, they're not very good at it. Okay, so they're going to have to come to terms with all of these things. So I'll stop for now. I know I went taller. I'll stop for now. And I'll turn it to Miko.
Okay, all right. That was great. So I'm going to touch on the legitimacy of the State of Israel, and then a little bit about BDS and anti-Semitism, or the anti-Semitism claims. I just want to touch on something that Ahmed just said about the difference between the right and the left in Israel is, in regards to the demographic issue, is that the far right, which is really the consensus, the majority, don't see that there are Palestinians. They don't even see them. The left are terrified by the demographic threat and want to figure a way out to move them away so that we can have our own Jewish majority. That's the left. That's the Zionist left, which is pretty scary when you think about it. I think the issue of the legitimacy of the State of Israel is important, and I think it's one of those things that people are afraid to touch on. I mean, how can you say that the Jewish state has no legitimacy? I mean, it sounds like a terrible thing to say. How can you say that Israel, Zionism, have no legitimacy, considering all the suffering that the Jews have had, have experienced and so forth? But I think it's an important place to start. I think it's an important thing to do. When people ask the question, and they ask this question quite a lot, does Israel have a right to exist? My answer is no. Flat and clear, no. Israel does not have a right to exist. And the simple explanation is because you cannot have a Jewish state in an Arab country without infringing on the rights of the local Arab population. It's as simple as that. And of course, 77 decades of the existence of the State of Israel has shown that very, very clearly. There's this idea among liberal Zionists that here in America particularly, but also among Israelis, that there once was this very innocent, beautiful, wonderful State of Israel. After 1967, it was corrupted, but we can bring it back, and the two-state solution is this magic pill. There's no evidence to that at all. There's absolutely no evidence to that at all. And this is, what's the 5th, the 4th? In a few days is going to be the 50th anniversary of the 1967 war. Okay? 50 years of the 1967 war. And people are still perpetuating this idea that it was a defensive war, that Israel was under attack, that there was an existential threat, and that the West Bank is the spoils of war. And, they started it, so hey, we won and tough luck. But again, that too has absolutely no There's no history to validate that claim. There's absolutely no history to validate that claim. And if we look at, and again, this goes to the legitimacy. When people say Israel proper and occupied Palestinian territories, and those are terms that are used all the time. There's Israel proper, which is pre-1967, and then there's the occupied Palestinian territories, which is the West Bank and Gaza. So, first of all, there are no Palestinian territories which are not occupied. All Palestine is occupied. And all of Israel is occupied Palestine. 1967 was not separate, was not in any way different than 1948. It's just that it happened 20 years later. So the process, and again, talking about the legitimacy, 1948, the Zionist movement and its militia were able to conquer almost 80% of Palestine, kick out 800,000, a million Palestinians, and rename Palestine, call it Israel, and now this occupation regime, which is really what Israel is, renamed the place Israel, and that was it. And for reasons that had nothing to do with the Palestinians and nothing to do with anybody but internal Israeli politics, they created the West Bank and let this new country called Jordan have it. And they created the Gaza Strip, and they had the Egyptians rule it. But these were Israeli decisions. These were areas that were drawn by Israel. Then 20 years later, now all those 20 years up to 1967, the Israeli military was waiting for the moment to take those lands. In other words, it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. And then 1967, the opportunity presented itself, boom, done, they took it. And the speed with which they started destroying Palestinian towns and cities and communities, whether it's the Maghrebi, the Moroccan neighborhood in front of the Western Wall, which is now this enormous plaza, which was wiped out like within hours, destroyed, to entire towns and cities, some of them, were built by Saladin, and again, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians thrown out. It happened immediately. It wasn't like somebody said, okay, let's think what we're going to do with this. Boom, it was done immediately. And then massive building for Jews was done immediately. In other words, nobody saw this as something separate. It was the completion of the job of 1948, something that wasn't completed. 20 years later, they completed the job. And that's the term that the Israeli generals, the commanders used, finishing the job of 1948, because they had a problem with, they didn't like waiting 20 years. That is the reality. So there is no Israel proper. There is no legitimate Israel. It's all occupied. None of it has any legitimacy. None of it has any legitimacy. Because it's all occupied illegally. There are no settlements that are legal and settlements that are illegal. They're all illegal settlements because they're all built on Palestinian land. So people often say to me, well, you mean Tel Aviv is a settlement? Of course, people in Tel Aviv, or people like myself who grew up in Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, we don't see ourselves as settlers. We're the good guy. We're the good Israelis. The settlers are the ones who live over there. But we're no different than they are. It's just that we became settlers earlier. So the idea that there are legal settlements and illegal settlements is ridiculous. The idea that there are settlers and non-settlers among Israelis is also ridiculous. We are all settlers. All Israeli towns, whether it's Tel Aviv or whether it's, they're all illegal settlements. And we are all illegal settlers. Every single one of us. We are like the whites in South Africa. Some of us were born there, so we're kind of born into it, but we don't belong, we're not from there. We are settlers. And again, that goes back to the legitimacy. There is no legitimacy to this creation. So how do we combat the legitimacy? First of all, I think we have to come to realize that there is no legitimacy. And that, again, going back to that question, which is very hard for people to answer and really makes people nervous, does Israel have a right to exist? So when you say no, they say, aha, genocide, Ahmadinejad, Iran, you want to wipe them off the face of the earth. But of course, that's not the conversation. Like Amar was saying, that's never the conversation. The conversation is all about the legitimacy of this regime not the legitimacy of the people who live there, though there can be an argument that they have no legitimacy either, but they're there. The reality is there are about 6 million Israelis today, about 6.1, 6.2 Palestinians. That's the reality. So the conversation is about the legitimacy of the state, the legitimacy of the regime. So how we talk about things, I think, is very important. What we call the country. I think remembering to call it Palestine is important. I think remembering to state that it is all occupied Palestine is extremely important. People say, oh, this is a dispute, it's a conflict, it's an occupation. Perhaps it's all of those things too. But basically, this is a regime that has been involved in genocide, in ethnic cleansing, and is maintaining an apartheid system from the very beginning. And again, some people claim, well, yes, there's an apartheid in the West Bank. There's apartheid all over the country. Like Amr was saying, when you have different parts of the population governed by different laws, well, that's apartheid. So maybe it's not exactly like the South African apartheid, but that's apartheid. So I think it's important for us to be clear and to call it what it is. It's a racist apartheid regime. If you have any doubts about the claimed genocide, because that's another thing people are scared. How can you say the Jews commit genocide? Well, take a look at the United Nations definition of the crime of genocide. Take a look at the list. Now, compare that with the list of Israel's policies over the last 7 decades. And it's not 100% identical, but it's almost 100% identical. There are a few things, genocidal acts within the crime of genocide that Israel has not yet committed, but the vast majority have been done. And it's a very easy comparison. It's on, you just take a look at it. It's very easy to do. So we have to say that, and we have to be clear about it. It's genocide, it's ethnic cleansing, and it's an apartheid regime. And it doesn't matter if they're Jews or they're not Jews, they're guilty of this reality. They're guilty of committing these crimes. Now, I'll tell you a little story, which came up recently. Some of you may know, I was arrested just a week ago or so, less than a week ago, when I was in Palestine. And I was actually in a prison for about 25 hours in a prison cell with a bunch of criminals. And when they learned what I was in for, it was a bit problematic because they hate, when I say they, I mean like, the descendants of Arab Jews, the people who are in the lower kind of socioeconomic, scale in Israel. They hate the Arabs completely, and they want to see them dead. But they hate the activist, the Jewish activist, the Israeli activist even more. So I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to spend those 6 hours with those people, but we had an interesting conversation. And, their claim was, I'm the problem. People like me are the problem because we're soft, you don't understand the Arabs, we don't get how violent and dangerous and bloodthirsty they are and so forth. And my point was, they're right. I am the problem, but not because of that. I am the problem because, again, like Amr was describing, Israel was established as a European colony, a settler colony for European Jews. They didn't come, so they ended up having to bring the Arabs and a bunch of others. But I told them a story. When I was in the middle school, 6th or 7th grade in Jerusalem, we suddenly heard this word called integration. And we thought, wow, integration. And what they did was, I went to a school where the good, white, wealthy, privileged kids went in Jerusalem. And just a few blocks away were the neighborhoods where what they call the Oriental Jews, which is interesting because Orient means east. Most of these people came from countries that are west to Israel. So why are they called Oriental? It's a very Eurocentric kind of thinking. So all these Arab Jews or Oriental Jews that they like to call them were they're in the bad neighborhoods and they had their own school. So the integration was to bring those kids into the same school as us. Now we're not in the same classes, but we were in the same building. And that was revolutionary. They brought these Jews to the same school as these Jews. And that was revolutionary. Arabs were not even, bringing Palestinians and Jews together, that's not even something that crossed anybody's mind. We are, even in Jerusalem, which is supposedly united, it's probably the most divided and racist city in the world, but even there are no the spaces where Israelis and Palestinians meet. Certainly not kids. Certainly not anything that's initiated by the government. That's how racist it is. That somebody made a comment here about the discrimination against the Arab Jews. Of course, I mean that's how racist it is. An inherently racist regime that has no legitimacy. It is not a democracy. It is not a response to the Holocaust. It is not, or if it is, it's not a proper response. And it has to be rejected. Even though it's, like I said, it's hard to reject the idea of a Jewish state, it has to be rejected because it has no legitimacy. And this is also one of the reasons that Israeli politicians can't say the word Jerusalem without saying the eternal, everlasting, forever, for thousands of years, capital of blah, 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 blah. You know, it's complete nonsense. They have their own sense of, I think, of insecurity, which is why they say this. You know, you can't talk about the legitimacy of the state of Israel. They feel threatened. They say, how dare you? You know, this conversation is not even something that's allowed, which exactly, I think, shows the weakness. But I think it's important for us to be absolutely clear and also to understand that 1967, the only significance of 1967 is as the completion of the conquest and the completion of the establishment of a single state in Palestine with exclusive rights for Jews. And so while, like Amar was saying, the conversation on the Arab side, the Palestinian side, is how do we all work together and go beyond this, the conversation on the Israeli side, where it's the media, it's the press, it's the politicians, it's, you know, private conversation, how do we kill them and get them the hell out of here? That's the conversation, that's the discourse. And just aside, you know, every single Israeli government since 1967 has done everything they possibly could to integrate the West Bank. And they have. So for example, again, you see the little things when you get arrested. The police force, the Israeli police force has a district called Shai, which is Judea and Samaria. And they have a logo, and the little pin that they wear, it's a purple little pin, it's got the shape of the West Bank, and it says, you know, the acronym for Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria. And if you look at their website, you see the list of all the cities and towns and villages that they serve. Not a single one is Palestinian. Not a single mention of a Palestinian town or a village within that entire region, and it's exactly the West Bank. You know, so that's how you know that it's done. You know, in terms of integration, there's no West Bank. Nobody ever thought there would be a West Bank or a Palestinian state. It's done. It's taken. So again, the question of legitimacy doesn't start or end with the 1967 borders. The question of legitimacy starts in 1948, and none of it should be given legitimacy, and I think calling it Palestine is important. I think calling it occupied Palestine is important. Referring to it as a racist apartheid regime, reminding people that they have been engaged in genocide for 7 decades, that is the argument, and I think it's an important one. So, you know, moving beyond it, probably of all the different forms of Palestinian resistance, which I think have all been legitimate, though not all very successful, you know, BDS comes to mind. BDS is the thing that everybody talks about now. You've got all this anti-BDS legislation here in the United States, particularly here in the state of New York. And Israel is terrified of BDS. I mean, terrified. They keep passing more and more laws to disallow BDS activists to come in. Now they're starting a special data bank of Israelis who are BDS activists because they can't deny us entry, but they have to do something with us, you know, so they have to have some kind of a database. They are so scared. Now, what's interesting is this. When you look at the demands of the BDS movement, I think the BDS was a gift to all of us, to people of conscience, because it gives us a clear pathway, what we need to do. In other words, it's very easy for us to come and say to the Palestinians, here's what we need to do for you. You know, here's how we're going to help you. As opposed to listening to what Palestinians say and then say, okay, well, this is the roadmap you've given us, we're going to follow that. And that's what BDS is. It's a roadmap by Palestinian civil society, a huge coalition of an enormous consensus. And look at the demands. Ending the military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, in other words, ending this military regime that exists in those areas, affording equal rights to all the Palestinians who live within the boundaries of the state, and respecting international law in regards to the right of the refugees to return and reclaim their property and their homes and so forth. What could be more reasonable than that? I mean, how much more reasonable can this be? There's not a single claim of all of these three that in any way, shape, or form goes against the non-Arab population, the non-Palestinian, settler colonial population, which is me, which are the Israelis. Nothing in it that's against them. It only talks about expanding the rights, expanding or getting rid of the privilege and affording everybody the same rights. It's absolutely so reasonable, and what's amazing is how they're able to turn the BDS movement and the BDS claims into some kind of a terrorist threat, an existential threat. And this is, again, because there's this incredible sense of insecurity that Israel has, because deep down inside they know there is no legitimacy to the state of Israel and to its claims. But I think it's important to, again, just look at the demands and think about just absolutely how reasonable and moderate they are. And how this really is a platform for all of us, for people of conscience, to get up and do the right thing and help the Palestinian people the way they want to be helped. In other words, the way they're telling us what we can do for them. And then again, the claim of anti-Semitism, which is really a ridiculous claim. So anti-Semitism is racism, right? Well, if it's racism to call for equal rights, if it's racism to say that it's wrong to have thousands of Palestinian political prisoners, if it's racism to say that Israel should not drop millions of tons of bombs on a civilian population in Gaza, if it's racism to say it's wrong for Israel to allocate only 3% of the water to the Palestinian population, even though the Palestinian population is the majority. The Israeli Water Authority controls all the water. Palestinians are allocated 3% of the water. If it's racism to go against all that, if it's anti-Semitic to go against all that, what is it called when you support all that? Is that open-mindedness? Is that, I mean, how do you even begin to say that is racism, that is wrong, that is anti-Semitic? But of course, when they have nothing to say, when there is no argument to legitimize their claims, they say anti-Semitism. And because people don't want to be called anti-Semitic, and people are afraid of this label of anti-Semitism, they hide in the corner and say nothing. But I think it's important to challenge this ridiculous claim of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is racism. How is any of this racism? None of it is racism. It's the opposite. Supporting Israel is supporting racism. Supporting Israel is supporting violence. Supporting Israel is supporting genocide. Supporting Israel is supporting an apartheid regime which is vicious and brutal. And again, not to be afraid to challenge that and say it's not anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And not to mention all the Jews that support BDS and all the Jews that support, Palestinian rights and so forth. So, just to kind of sum it up, I think it requires those of us that are on this side of the issue, that care about this issue, that want to see justice and eventually peace, but take hold in Palestine, we need to up our game a little bit. We need to be out there and not be afraid to say these things. Does Israel have a right to exist? No. That doesn't mean all Jews that live in Palestine need to die. That's not the argument. And that's not the argument that's being made. Is BDS anti-Semitic? Absolutely not. There's nothing in the claims, the BDS claims, that goes against the Jewish people who live in Palestine. Nothing at all. And is it all anti-Semitic? Of course not. There is no anti-Semitism here. There is no racism here. It's exactly the opposite. And then when we claim this and we speak clearly, then it makes it much easier for us to move forward. And I believe, like Amir suggested, I believe that the single democracy in Palestine, with equal rights, with implementation of the right of return so that people do get their homes back and get their land back, is inevitable. I don't think it's a dream. I don't think it's something that will happen I think it's inevitable. I think it's going to happen much sooner than most people think, and Israel is crumbling and falling apart. So overall, I'm optimistic, and I would invite you to be optimistic as well, as the same time as become engaged and active and not be afraid to talk about this. Thank you.